Death and burial are always an area that archaeology shines in. On the whole, tombs and burials are some of the most salient archaeological remains that can tell us about societies, cultures, and ideologies. Tombs are also usually more conservative and preserved much better than domestic settlements. Burials are, of course, one of the key windows through which we can reconstruct periods and gain insight into societal dynamics at times where texts and other kinds of archaeology can't illuminate things. Death is an issue in every society. It's a human experience that we share with every member of our species regardless of the time period. Every human has or will undergo death. It's therefore something that every culture is in some way concerned with. Death is an inherently dangerous moment for us, not just materially, but for a society like the Greeks, it creates uncertainty around things like inheritance, direction, and safety for a family, or a group or tribe, even today, actually. Or in the case of public figures, it creates instability in terms of societal direction. There's equally the emotional and personal element of death, which sets our world into a state of liminality, where things don't feel quite normal or right. Religiously speaking, we are thrust into a kind of limbo when faced with death, a situation in which things feel upside down and uncomfortable for us. In the ancient world, just as today, emotional and social links have a higher tendency to break down or not work in the context of a death. This makes the funeral a pivotal time of agency in which rapid change can occur very quickly. Death is what we can call a weak social moment, in which boundaries are most subject to change. In the 70s and 80s, on the back of processualist archaeology, classical archaeology began questioning meta-narratives and trying to answer universal questions relating to the human species, especially by looking at the burial record. Taking cues from anthropological theory, it was understood that funerary representations could display the dead's social identity, whether in realism or idealism. In other words, burials and tombs represent an arena in which ritual action intersects with social structure to communicate ideals of social persona. On a material level, this means that if archaeologists could excavate a tomb in context, its iconography and contextual infrastructure could be used to reconstruct elements of the occupant's personality, social position, and community standing, and of course tell us a bit more about the society at large. The problem here, as outlined most prominently by Professor Mike Parker Pearson and the Cambridge School of Archaeological Theory, is that funerary ritual often distorts reality. The vision of life that a deceased may wish to communicate is more than likely idealized than truly representative. To what extent, then, can tombs, such as this, truly tell us about lived experiences or reality? We have to be careful with excavation to distinguish between what's an ideal and what's representative of someone. This is done by careful and scientific collection of data, coupled with things like statistical analysis, expenditure analysis, location analysis, and comparing those against comparable patterns and ethnographic information. A great case study for this kind of scientific analysis is the now famous shaft graves at Mycenae that I mentioned way back at the beginning of this series. As we saw, these graves are earlier than the palace complex, and they stand really at the beginning of the Mycenaean world. While not building palaces, the tomb builders filled these buildings with immense prestige items, which signals the beginning of hierarchical thinking and social organization. The natural question that arises is, who's buried here? Who's in these tombs? What kind of person or family could amass this much wealth in this kind of period? Are the occupants to be considered part of the same family? Or are they competing families? What do these individuals tell us about social mobility in the shaft grave period? Usually, during these early periods, power was gained meritocratically and earned, usually by force. But what we're seeing with shaft graves is a concerted attempt to pass on generational wealth and keep power in the family of a select few. The child burials here testify to this. By affording a child the same grave honours as the adults, it's clearly a signal of familial power and prestige. Rich child burials, in this context, provide a way for families to cement generational inheritance and power. No longer is it about acquiring power during life, you can receive it on the basis of your familial inheritance. Our first port of call, of course, would be to use DNA or isotopic analysis on the bodies in the tomb to see if they're related to each other. But unfortunately, this can't be done for these burials, having been failed every time it's been attempted. Some effort has been made to try and reconstruct the faces of the occupants based on cranial and skull shapes, but this methodology is still relatively new in archaeology and it's uncertain at best. Work on this did provide some tentative images of 3 males, all of which have a distinct and similar jawline and facial features, especially those that are housed in 3 of the tombs, which may indicate there was a familial relationship. But this methodology in general is still somewhat unscientific and a bit too interpretive, so it can't be relied upon to make definitive statements in its current form. As we move a bit closer into the classical period, it's worth examining some basic archaeological and anthropological theory around the nature and process of burials. Arnold Van Gennep, the German-French ethnographer and folklorist, best known for his works on rites of passage, suggested that death acted as a kind of liminal category that transitions not only the individual but also the immediate family into a different social category. Death is an initiatory process by which we, as the hypothetical deceased, transition from the world of the living into the world of the dead, or ancestors, conceptualized as having a different type of existence in a different type of place. Van Gennep argued that in order to navigate these moments of transition safely, human societies engaged in a tripartite system of passage ceremony, that we now call the funeral. First was a rite of separation that represents the initial or normal daily living conditions of the deceased and served to sever the link with the previous identity. This was followed by rites of marginality, considered to be transitory and elusive in terms of the time for the deceased. We can conceptualize the dead in this phase as being uninitiated, outside of time and technically outside of any kind of society. The spirit or the soul is no longer part of the world of the living, but it's also hasn't been accepted among the dead yet. Ritual by the living in this stage was therefore intended to collapse this marginal liminal state as quickly as possible. Finally, the system was concluded by what Gennep called rites of aggregation, in which the deceased individual was fully integrated into the world of the dead. We know that by the time of classical Greece, burial traditions were divided into 3 elements: the prothesis, the ekphora, and internment. The prothesis procedures were inherently private and often quite lengthy. They were performed by members of the close family and involved washing with the body, clothing it, and placing obols or drachmae in the mouth as payment for kleron. Women were hypothesized to play a major role in this stage of the rites, often preparing the body, which was then anointed and adorned with wreaths. Often wrapped in dark robes, the women would stand around the bier, with the chief mourner being either the wife or the mother, usually standing by the head. They would then lead the mourning by chanting and singing laments for the deceased, which often took the forms of shrieks or wails. This could often be quite a violent procedure, from what we can tell of the iconography, involving the tearing of hair and clothing and striking or beating their torso. These evocative funerary laments were, of course, intended to guide the soul of the deceased into the underworld. Following the prothesis, the ekphora was the public funeral procession, where the body would be carried from the house to the burial place, conceptualized as moving the individual from the place of the living to the place of the dead. This would have been a much bigger affair, with members of the public able to observe what was happening. Depending on the wealth of the family, they could also hire people to professionally mourn the dead during these processions, usually ones that were sponsored by the state. However, no religious officials could be involved because of miasma. Finally, you would intern the person via inhumation or cremation, depending on the period, marking their assimilation into the world of the dead and the entry of their soul into the underworld. Throughout this whole process, libations, known as goetia, were performed. Goetia were sometimes initiated by locks of hair and usually consisted of libations of honey, milk, water, wine, perfumes, and oils, all mixed in varying amounts, and were usually poured at the grave site, either on the steps supporting the stele or over the actual dirt containing the shaft grave. This whole process would have been followed by the enigmasmata, which was comprised mainly of offerings to the dead, including things like first fruits and wine. There was also a funeral feast called the Piridein, in which the individual was the host, and the feast was a sign of gratitude towards those who took part in burying him. Once completed, the house and the household objects were cleansed, usually with seawater or hyssop, and the women most closely related to the dead took part in ritual washing in water. After 30 days, some members of the family would reconvene for a triakostia, a kind of feast and a second funeral, especially for those who couldn't be present at the first funeral. Following the 30-day period throughout the rest of the year, families would routinely visit the grave to perform offerings and libations. Contact with the dead was thought to pollute the soul, however, so the family members had to wear a laurel or other plant-based indicator that their family was unclean, at least until they had undergone purification from miasma. Only after the first year would the family be fully reaccepted into society and considered free of pollution. It's important to realise, though, that these kinds of procedures are ideal burial types. We have a lot of instances and times where these procedures were not followed. For instance, around 430 BC, there was a mass burial inside the Keramikos in Athens, one that we think may have been related to a plague that occurred there around the same time. Due in part to being unable to properly have contact with bodies, the burial procedures clearly had to change, along with the fact that people were dying at such a rapid pace that prolonged customs could not be engaged for each individual. Of course, broadening our scope a little bit, understanding elements of burial like this allows us to reconstruct parts of people's lives and what they deemed important. Funerary monuments, like the burial stelae, gave us indications of how the individuals saw themselves, or at least what kind of messages they wanted to convey to the world about their social position. Notable inclusions are things like wealth, political affiliation, powerful connections during life, and which deities they worshipped. By comparing these personal idealized messages to their actual bones, we can get pretty good indications of how the person actually lived and what was going on inside their head, what kind of stresses or labor their bodies faced by looking at the wear on their skeletons, and how they exerted themselves during life. Now, of course, another part of funerary archaeology that's seen a lot of development in recent years is isotopic and aDNA analysis. We can usually extract ancient DNA from bone remains, either of animals or humans. By studying things like carbon and nitrogen values, we can trace elements of diet, such as whether someone ate more or less meat, and where that animal came from, based on comparing the values to geological signatures. Since meat tends to be more of a high-value item in the ancient world, if we have two cemeteries, we can compare the aDNA qualities of individuals in each grave to better understand their diet, and through that, their social class. Isotopic analysis can also tell us a lot about how diets changed throughout time periods, such as whether people on average ate more or less meat during the Hellenistic or Roman periods. Another potential option is to test strontium isotopes, which can give us an indication of which water source somebody is drinking from and how far away they're getting it from. We have to be somewhat careful with aDNA though, as just because someone is born in a certain place doesn't necessarily mean they're part of that community or hold that identity. But it's nevertheless a fascinating insight for future research that's still really in its genesis. So with that, thank you so much for watching, and thank you for sticking with me throughout this entire series. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.